Welcome back to the Fact Fab Lab channel, history buffs and truth seekers. Today, we delve into one of the darkest and most shameful chapters in American military history, the My Lai Massacre. A day when the lines between soldier and executioner blurred with devastating consequences, leaving hundreds of innocent lives brutally extinguished. This is a story of unimaginable horror, a stark reminder of the brutal realities of war, and a pivotal moment that shook the very foundations of American society. Host, March 16, 1968. Quang Ngai Province, South Vietnam. 3 years into the United States' deepening involvement in the Vietnam War, Charlie Company, part of the 11th Infantry Brigade, Americal Division, received orders, deploy to the village of My Lai. The mission: to neutralize suspected Viet Cong guerrillas, communist insurgents from South Vietnam, backed by the North, believed to be using the village as a hideout. The troops landed, anticipating resistance, a firefight, but what they encountered was far from the enemy they expected. Instead, they found unarmed civilians, mostly women, children, and elderly men. Little did they know, this encounter would spiral into an atrocity that would send shockwaves across the globe, exposing the brutal underbelly of a war that was already tearing America apart. To truly understand the gravity of what happened that day, we need to rewind a bit and understand the complex history that led to this devastating conflict. Standing in front of a timeline graphic or historical map, Vietnam's history is one of struggle against foreign domination. Starting in the mid-19th century, France gradually asserted its colonial rule, fully incorporating Vietnam into French Indochina by 1887. This colonial grip would last for decades, fueling nationalist sentiments. Then came World War II. In 1939, the global conflict erupted, and in 1941, Japan invaded Vietnam. This invasion galvanized the nationalist movement, leading to the rise of the Viet Minh, a communist-led resistance under the leadership of the iconic Ho Chi Minh. Their goal: Vietnamese independence. With Japan's surrender in 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam's independence, establishing control in Hanoi. However, France, unwilling to relinquish its colonial power, returned, igniting the First Indochina War. This bloody conflict raged for nearly a decade, culminating in France's decisive defeat at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The subsequent Geneva Conference in 1954 temporarily divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. North Vietnam became the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, while South Vietnam remained under the anti-communist Emperor Bo Day, with the promise of future nationwide elections. But these elections never materialized. Instead, Bo Day was eventually ousted in 1955 by Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem, who had the backing of the United States. Diem became the first president of the Republic of Vietnam, the official name of South Vietnam. The country remained fractured, setting the stage for further conflict. In the north, Ho Chi Minh consolidated his communist state, while in the south, Diem's increasingly authoritarian regime, plagued by corruption and opposition, was supported by the West. By the late 1950s, communist insurgents in the south, known as the National Liberation Front or Viet Cong, began their attacks, fueled by support from the north, aiming to reunify Vietnam under communist rule. Simultaneously, the United States, deeply entrenched in Cold War ideology, feared the domino effect, the belief that if South Vietnam fell to communism, neighboring countries would follow. With China already communist and North Vietnam firmly under Ho Chi Minh, Washington's alarm bells were ringing. Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy poured in aid equipment and military advisors to prop up Diem's government. By 1963, around 16,000 American advisors were in Vietnam. However, Diem's repressive policies, particularly against the Buddhist majority, sparked widespread unrest. Eventually, his regime was overthrown in a coup, with at least tacit US approval, and Diem was assassinated. But this didn't bring stability, instead it created a power vacuum in the south. A crucial turning point came in August 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin incidents. While the first incident involving the USS Maddox was a confirmed clash, the second remains highly debated. Nevertheless, the Johnson administration presented both as acts of aggression, leading to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This resolution granted President Johnson broad authority to escalate American involvement without a formal declaration of war, paving the way for the full-scale commitment of US ground troops by 1965. By 1968, over 500,000 American troops were in Vietnam. The war was a massive drain on the US economy, costing billions, and public support was waning. It was in this volatile environment that Charlie Company arrived in South Vietnam in December 1967. For their first 3 months in the country, Charlie Company hadn't seen direct combat with Viet Cong or North Vietnamese forces. Instead, they suffered casualties, 28 in total, mostly from insidious mines and booby traps hidden along seemingly peaceful trails and rice paddies. These unseen enemies took a heavy psychological toll on the young, often inexperienced soldiers. Frustration, fear and a growing resentment towards the Vietnamese civilian population began to fester. Intelligence reports pointed to My Lai, a village near the central coast, as a suspected stronghold of the Viet Cong's 48th Battalion believed to be responsible for many of the attacks. Captain Ernest Medina, Charlie Company's commanding officer, issued direct orders: sweep the village thoroughly and destroy anything walking, crawling or growling. When questioned about who constituted the enemy, Medina reportedly gave chilling instructions: anybody that was running from us, hiding from us, or appeared to be the enemy. If a man was running, shoot him. Sometimes even if a woman with a rifle was running, shoot her. And when asked if this included unarmed women and children, Medina allegedly stated, "They're all Viet Cong. Now go and get them." With these horrifying orders echoing in their minds, and fueled by weeks of mounting tension and loss, Charlie Company entered the village of My Lai on the morning of March 16, 1968. What unfolded there was an unimaginable descent into brutality. Instead of armed fighters, they encountered unarmed civilians, women tending to their homes, children playing, elderly men going about their day. These villagers offered no resistance, no threat. They were simply met with violence. The killings began abruptly and indiscriminately. A machine gunner later recounted witnessing a fellow soldier bayoneting a villager, then shoving an elderly man into a well and dropping a grenade in after him. Near a small temple, a group of 15 to 20 people, mostly women and children, were kneeling, praying, holding incense. Without warning, they were all executed with shots to the head. Elsewhere in the village, large groups of civilians were rounded up. Under the command of Lieutenant William Calley, who led one of Charlie Company's platoons, around 70 to 80 villagers were herded to the edge of an irrigation ditch. Calley, shouting orders, commanded his men to open fire. He himself joined in the slaughter. Women clutching their children were mowed down in cold blood. One of the most chilling accounts describes Calley approaching a woman holding an infant. He seized her by the hair, shot her in the head with his .45 caliber pistol, and then, standing over the crying baby, coldly murdered the child as well. Captain Ernest Medina, the overall commander, was present in the village. While he later claimed ignorance of the scale of the killings, multiple soldiers testified to seeing him at the scene of several murders, including the shooting of a wounded defenseless woman. Throughout My Lai, unimaginable atrocities were committed. Soldiers used bayonets to stab civilians, executed the wounded with pistols, and even fired grenade launchers into groups of terrified villagers. Some, fueled by a horrifying bloodlust, went from hut to hut, setting homes ablaze, killing livestock, and gunning down anyone they encountered. The roads, yards and fields became littered with corpses, some shot, others brutally mutilated. Some victims were found with the chilling mark C Company carved into their chests. One soldier later testified, "I cut their throats, cut off their hands, cut out their tongues, scalped them. I did. A lot of people were doing it, and I just followed. I lost all sense of direction." Army photographer Ronald Harberley, embedded with the unit, bravely documented the massacre with his personal camera. His uncensored color photographs would later serve as irrefutable and haunting visual evidence of the crimes committed. Harberley described witnessing the indiscriminate killing of women and children, bodies piled high in ditches and along roadsides, and one soldier even riding a water buffalo while repeatedly stabbing it with his bayonet. He watched in horror as an elderly man, desperately yelling "No Viet Cong, no Viet Cong," was gunned down alongside two small children. Sexual violence was also rampant. At least 20 Vietnamese women and girls were raped during the massacre. The victims ranged in age from 10 to 45, and at least 9 were under 18. Some assaults were committed in front of other soldiers, with instances of gang rape, and in several cases the women were mutilated and murdered immediately afterward. By the time the killing finally stopped, roughly 3 hours after it began, as many as 504 Vietnamese civilians had been murdered. Among the dead were 50 children aged 3 or younger, 69 between the ages of 4 and 7, and 27 elderly victims in their 70s and 80s. The death toll could have been even higher if not for the courageous intervention of one man. Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, a 24-year-old helicopter pilot on a routine patrol over My Lai, along with his crew, door gunner Lawrence Colburn, and crew chief Glenn Andreotta, witnessed the unfolding horror from above. They saw civilians being shot at point-blank range, bodies piling up in ditches and near huts. Circling back over a trench filled with corpses, they spotted faint movement. Hoping to save survivors, Thompson landed near the ditch and approached a sergeant on the ground, later identified as David Mitchell. When Thompson asked if they could help evacuate the wounded, Mitchell chillingly replied that he would help them out of their misery. Appalled by the sheer brutality, Thompson confronted Lieutenant William Calley, asking if medical assistance could be provided. Calley's reported response was that a hand grenade was the only method he had for their evacuation. As Thompson lifted off, he looked back and saw Mitchell firing into the ditch, shooting at the defenseless survivors. Moments later, the helicopter crew witnessed Captain Ernest Medina kicking an unarmed woman before shooting her at point-blank range. Believing more lives were in immediate danger, Thompson spotted a group of villagers seeking refuge in a nearby bunker as American troops advanced. Without hesitation, he landed his helicopter between the soldiers and the civilians, instructing his crew that if the Americans opened fire, they were to return fire in defense of the villagers. Thompson then approached a lieutenant, later identified as Stephen Brooks, informing him of the women and children inside the bunker. When Brooks suggested using a grenade, Thompson insisted he would handle it himself. He bravely coaxed between 12 and 16 civilians from the bunker and personally stood guard as they were evacuated in 2 helicopter trips. Returning to the area one last time, the crew spotted movement in another ditch. Specialist Glenn Andreatta climbed down and emerged with a wounded but alive 4-year-old girl, who was then flown to safety. Upon returning to base, Thompson reported the horrific events to his section leader, stating, "It's mass murder out there. They're rounding them up and herding them in ditches and then just shooting them." His damning indictment continued, "In their slaughter of innocent civilians, the American infantry is no different from the Nazis." The truth about what happened at My Lai remained buried for over a year, largely due to a deliberate effort to cover it up within the military. It was the persistence of soldier and aspiring journalist Ronald Redenauer, who learned about the massacre and wrote a detailed letter to Congress and the Pentagon, that finally triggered an official investigation. Journalist Seymour Hersh then broke the shocking story to the public in November 1969, and Ronald Haberle's devastating photographs soon followed, appearing in newspapers and magazines across the nation. The stark visual evidence, coupled with first-hand accounts, ignited public outrage and further eroded the already dwindling support for the Vietnam War. In the wake of the scandal, the Army launched an extensive investigation led by Lieutenant General William R. Pierce. The Pierce Commission meticulously collected testimony from hundreds of witnesses, confirming the horrific war crimes, including mass murder, rape, and the subsequent cover-up. In total, 28 officers and enlisted men were recommended for prosecution. Yet, in the end, only 14 were formally charged, and of those only one, Lieutenant William Calley, was convicted. In 1971 he was found guilty of the premeditated murder of 22 Vietnamese civilians and sentenced to life in prison. However, President Richard Nixon later controversially commuted his sentence, and Calley served just 3.5 years under house arrest. Captain Medina was court-martialed but acquitted of all charges,